Welcome back everyone to another episode of the Frankenstein Reader's Guide. We've been looking so far at all of the characters in Shelley's novel. Now we're going to be moving on in the second half of the series to the themes, and we're going to begin with one of what I think is one of the most important themes, and that is nature. It plays a big role in the story, both reflecting the personalities of some of the characters, but also reflecting the morality of the characters as well, and I'm going to argue that it also provides a kind of spiritual and moral foundation for the novel too. So there's a lot to unpack with respect to nature. Let's get into it. Part 1. Man in nature, man against nature. Nature provides a stunning backdrop to so much of Shelley's novel. We begin with Captain Walton in the Arctic. We go on various adventures with Victor and sometimes Henry across Europe, from the bottom of England all the way up to Scotland and the Shetland Islands, through the mountains in Geneva. There's so much to explore in this novel, and the characters are always going on these adventures. Nature is also in many ways a character unto itself, and it even has relationships and effects on the characters. Sometimes it is there to console them when they are grieving, but other times it can appear indifferent, violent, and even cruel. But often it plays this consoling nature, and usually if a character is consoled by nature or integrated by nature, it offers a kind of spiritual salvation or peace for them. In the first part of the novel, when Captain Walton is meeting Victor for the first time and they're getting to know each other, he notices something about Victor and his relationship with nature. Even broken in spirit as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seems still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double existence. He may suffer misery and be overwhelmed by disappointments, yet, when he is retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures. So nature is being invoked in two ways here by Walton. Firstly, it's being described as something that gives Victor a lot of peace. He's been described so far as quite wretched, he's quite ill. Walton doesn't quite know why yet, he'll learn that later, but nature is the one thing that seems to give Victor some kind of solace. And when we learn what Victor has been through, it also seems to give him a kind of salvation here, in the sense that Walton uses these words like divinity to describe the effect that nature has on Victor. So nature is kind of like a spiritual guide for Victor as much as it is just something that he can find solace in. In the previous episode, when we looked at Henry and Elizabeth, I noted how, as characters, they both have a certain way of relating to nature. Both of them see themselves very much as a part of it. They don't want to dominate it or control it. And at the end of their stories, just before they die, they actually tell Victor to start appreciating nature more. And that is one of the last things that they say in both cases. And having read the whole novel and then rereading it, one thing that you'll find is that it seems like, if Walton's description of Victor is accurate, that Victor has finally taken their advice. Although it's really being done for Victor because he has nothing else to hold on to at this point. The only thing he has left is the beauty of nature, because he's lost all of those personal ties throughout the story. However, there are two conflicting views of nature in Frankenstein. We have this idea coming from characters like Henry and Elizabeth, where being in nature is consoling, where it's very important to integrate yourself as a part of nature, to accept nature's mysteries and to be overawed by them. That's the sort of positive side. And then we have Victor's perspective, the scientific perspective. And in this perspective, it's not so much that you want to become a part of nature, and you certainly don't want to respect its mysteries. Instead, you want to have dominion over nature. And that is what gets you true divinity, not just being a part of it, but becoming a master of it. We see this philosophy really coming to the fore when Victor attends university and he meets two professors. The first professor is not that enamored by Victor's interest in mysticism and natural philosophy and alchemy, but the second professor, Professor Walden, he is a little bit more interested in this, and he gives this speech about those old philosophies and also about the power of modern science. The ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature, and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates, and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. So on this view, which is a view that Victor himself will come to accept, the best way to relate to nature is to essentially become a god yourself, and science allows us to do that. We don't just want to be passive recipients observing nature, instead we want to take control over nature, to uncover all of its secrets, and the way that Walden describes this, that in itself is a kind of divinity, to know every single secret of the universe, because essentially if you know all the secrets of the universe, you do become the omnipotent, omniscient God who can dominate and control and know about everything in the universe. Unfortunately, one of the problems with this philosophy, and we see this with Victor's character, is that in trying to control nature and have dominion over it, it often means that the person isolates themselves from nature and from their community, and this causes them to do deeply immoral things, like creating a creature without any consideration of the consequences, and then abandoning that creature. We see this begin to happen as Victor becomes consumed with his experiments, and he starts to lose sight of nature and even his ties to his family, bearing in mind that he's described his family in very positive terms prior to this point in the story. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul, in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage. But my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scene around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long a time. So what we're seeing here is essentially a moral degeneration as Victor becomes consumed with his urge to dominate life and to become a divinity himself. He becomes separate from nature. He's no longer able to find solace or peace in its beauties because he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to be the passive recipient. He wants to take control over nature. And then as he does this and becomes more obsessed, he then drifts away from his close personal relationships. And so we can see how this view of nature is ultimately corrosive morally. Victor isolates himself from his community, from nature, and then he loses his sense of moral perspective, and unfortunately terrible things will happen as a result. Part 2. Nature and the Creature. So all the characters in Frankenstein have this ability to find solace in nature, even if it's somewhat turbulent for characters like Victor. And this is also true of the creature, but the way that the creature relates to nature, the way that Shelley portrays this, is quite different from the way that other characters relate to nature. And she subverts a lot of classic metaphors about birth and life when describing the creature to show how set apart he is from normal human beings. The first time we see this is with the creature's creation. He is created during the autumn, which is typically not the symbolic part of the year for new life. That would be spring, obviously. That's the season of new life, blossoming, blooming, all bright and wonderful. To be born in autumn is to be born towards the end of the year. Things aren't quite completely desolate like they would be in winter, but the year is certainly starting to die, and autumn itself is associated with things like longer evenings, darkness, Halloween, so you've got all the spirits coming out and all that supernatural stuff as well. And so you have all of these darker connotations, a lot of them oriented towards death, and this is the time at which the creature is born. And it does symbol how the creature is, in many ways, a creature of death. He's not made in the typical way. He's presumably made from dead body parts, although we never get the full story as to the creature's making, but it does seem that that is the case, that he is just made from corpses. And so he is very much a creature of death. And so he's born in this period of the year which is typically associated with death. But that obviously sets him apart from most human beings, who, if you're going to symbolically portray new life in that sense, it would usually be the spring in which you would choose to do that. Another thing that Shelley does that I really appreciate is she almost uses a sort of leitmotif for the creature. Whenever he appears, often there's this bolt of lightning to sort of signal or herald him, which obviously is very dramatic. You know, reminds me of a lot of classic horror films where that style of thing is done. But it also connects to his creation as well, because he is born of some kind of bolt of energy. And so it's a nice metaphor because it has this foreboding aspect to it. Lightning is associated with storms, with violence and danger, but it also reflects again his creation, how he was made. It's also somewhat ironic that she uses lightning because obviously the connotations of lightning are rarely positive. And so it implies that the creature is someone who is dangerous, violent, and obviously the creature does end up that way, but his moral character is actually quite spotless for most of his early period of life, and it's only later that he becomes the real monster of the story. The final interesting thing about the creature is how he relates to nature. As I said, he does find solace in nature, but not in the typical way that the other characters do. Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserable and alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures, who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one in which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. There's a clear metaphor here between the isolation of the monster and the landscapes that he chooses to find solace in, and the places where he chooses to dwell. He can't find solace in the beautiful aspects of nature, the aspects that are full of life, because those are the bits where human beings go, and wherever they go, the creature will be excluded and cast aside. And so he has to go to these barren wastelands, and that's why he eventually finds solace in these places, because they are the only places in which he can truly be at peace, because everywhere else he will be ostracized and abused. So metaphorically, this obviously represents his isolation, because the landscapes resemble the way that he's treated, but also it makes sense for him to be drawn to these places, because they are really a refuge for him, because they're the only place where he can be guaranteed to be safe and left alone from the humanity who is incredibly cruel to him. Interestingly though, Victor himself sometimes becomes enamored by these aspects of nature as well. We see there's a moment in the story where he admires the lightning, so he's already tapping in to that more violent, dark side of nature. And towards the end of the story, when he's finding solace in nature, he's not in a picaresque romantic scene anymore. He's in the bleak, barren, desolate Arctic. And so in many ways, by the end of the story, he becomes very much like the monster, by isolating everyone and then losing everyone through death and murder and all the other things, mistakes that he makes. He eventually becomes exactly the same as the monster, finding refuge in these barren landscapes, because it represents his own barrenness, his own isolation and loneliness. Part 3. Romanticism. Nature as God. So one of the primary themes of the Romantic movement in literature is this appreciation for the beauty and benevolence of nature. You find this time and time again in Romantic poetry and in Romantic philosophers like Rousseau, this idea that nature is this wonderful thing, everything is sort of wonderful in nature and it's only society that corrupts and corrodes things. And we definitely see this philosophy coming through in Shelley's novel. But also we can see why people might have thought this at the time period. You're talking about a period of time where people, well, wealthy people, were becoming much more mobile. You know, women like Shelley wouldn't have been able to go on these trips to Europe very easily in the past. And so she's going to these places with Byron and Shelley, and she's seeing these, these wonderful aspects of nature, and then these things inform her novel, and they also inform the Romantics. They're seeing these aspects of nature for the first time. And if you're coming from Britain, where the countryside is generally speaking quite tame, we don't really have epic landscapes in the way that a lot of European countries do. And so you're seeing these things for the first time and you're going to be completely blown away by them. I think it's something that we today can struggle to appreciate, because even if you never go and see these places, you've seen great mountainscapes in film, you can see them in pictures, and so everything is much more vivid to us and we know much more before we even go somewhere now. And so things don't seem as magical to us, I think, as they would have done to people seeing these places for the first time. And we get a sense of how intense it must have been to experience nature like this for the first time early on in the novel. When Victor is about to tell Walton his story, he says essentially that because of the extreme nature that they are currently in, being in the Arctic, it actually makes it more likely that Walton will believe Victor's story, because nature out here itself is so strange and mystical. Were we among the tamer scenes of nature, I might fear to encounter your unbelief, perhaps your ridicule, but many things will appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions, which would provoke the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature. So there's something almost magical about nature itself, especially these very dramatic scenes of nature, that cause people to be more susceptible to strange supernatural stories. Again, it ties into this idea that there's something divine and spiritual in nature, especially when you're in these particular environments. Another way that Shelley reflects the romantic idea of nature is that she does endorse this tabula rasa theory of human development, and we see this obviously in the development of the creature, which we've talked about before. The fact that when he's born, he doesn't really have any moral compass. He's not predisposed to evil or good. If anything, he is predisposed towards good, you might say. But it's really through reading certain texts and observing people's behaviour that he develops a moral character, and even his corruption is caused by his interactions with people. It's the fact that he's excluded, isolated and abused by humanity that turns him into a monster, not his nature. At the same time, though, there are elements of the creature that do appear to be natural. For example, the fact that he is a herbivore, that's not something he would have learned from humanity in any way, but it does sort of suggest that he has maybe some natural benevolent proclivities, again suggesting that Shelley does take a more positive view on how nature disposes us, that we're sort of disposed towards good, but ultimately we can be turned if we're raised poorly. At the same time, though, Shelley isn't fully sentimental about nature either, and I think that in many ways nature sort of plays a godlike role in the story, in the sense that Victor himself sometimes feels isolated and punished by nature, as if it's sort of a god figure punishing him for the wrongs that he's done. So when Victor hears about Justine's arrest for killing William, he travels home, and on his way home he looks out at nature, and he has this moment where he feels horrified because he feels very disgusted in what he has done, but nature is beautiful and he feels out of sync with it because of this. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace or to mock my unhappiness? So Victor sort of implies maybe that nature is being cruel in this moment, mocking him, abusing him. And this might, lead us to think that maybe nature is somewhat indifferent to whatever is going on. And that is certainly true to an extent, but I think there's something maybe a bit deeper going on in this passage. Firstly, it illustrates how Victor has really become out of step with nature. By putting himself against it through his ambition, he's now isolated from nature. He can't find solace in its scenes anymore. But secondly, it's almost like nature is chastising him in some way. It's almost like you have this beautiful angel or god, and you're mesmerized by it because it's an angel and it's beautiful, but you also know it's there to condemn you because you've done something bad, and so you can't look at its beauty. And in fact, looking at its beauty makes it worse because you're looking at something so pure, benevolent and wonderful, and you know that you're not reflecting that back because you know that you've done something terrible. And that's really, I think, what comes out of this scene. So one thing that I didn't notice when I first read Frankenstein many years ago was just how little religion plays, and by that I mean Christianity, in the story. There are religious references here and there, but it's not a fundamental theme to the narrative. But that's not to say that spirituality is not present in the novel. In fact, it is present in the novel, and as has maybe become quite obvious from me talking about this, it's often used in relation to nature. Nature being described as divine, or having control over nature being described as divine. And people who seek godhood are ultimately, things don't work out for them. But people who connect with nature, who are in touch with it, but don't try and dominate it, those people often find themselves, even if they die, they tend to have quite a peaceful life, they tend to be quite happy and content, in a way that those who reject nature aren't. And there does seem to me to be a kind of religious use of nature here. In the same way that to be a Christian, a part of that is to accept God's love and to accept the mysteries of God and to believe and have faith. You see a similar thing in nature as well. In a character like Elizabeth, she accepts nature, she accepts the mysteries of nature, she doesn't want to control it or become, a force of nature, whereas Victor does. Victor is like a sort of, Lucifer figure, almost, a fallen angel type. And so it seems to me there really is this sort of metaphorical understanding of nature as a kind of divinity. And in order to have peace in Shelley's novel, you need to integrate yourself with nature and to accept your place in it rather than trying to obtain mastery over it. Nature also plays a redemptive role as well for many of the characters. As we see towards the end of the story, the only thing that Victor finds solace in, and the only thing that the creature finds solace in, is nature. Even if it's the most bleak, barren and brutal aspects of nature, they can still find beauty in these spaces, and they can find a kind of solace and redemption in them as well. Part 4. Conclusion. So we've looked at nature and romanticism in this video. We've looked at how nature is reflected in the characters' ethical journeys. We've seen how Victor is someone who initially finds peace and solace in nature, ultimately turns his back on that idea when he wants to control and dominate nature, and how this really contributes to his moral downfall. It isolates him from nature, from his family, and from his moral convictions and beliefs, and that's what causes him to then do an experiment and then abandon that experiment as well. We see how Shelley inverts aspects of nature to describe the creature's moral character, the fact that he's born in the darker side of the year, in the autumn, the way that the monster finds solace in the bleak aspects of nature, which represent his personality, incredibly lonely, incredibly desolate. And we've also seen how nature plays a kind of divine, godlike role in the story as well. It's something that characters find peace in, it's something that seems to judge them when they do wrong, and it's something that they find that they can redeem themselves in, as well as we see with Victor and the creature at the end of the novel. So that's everything I want to say about nature in Frankenstein. I really like books from this period, whether it's Frankenstein or, a bit later I suppose, but things like Dracula or Anne Radcliffe's works. The way that these writers, they were seeing these, they were going to Europe and they were seeing these countries for the first time, and they were clearly just so overawed by the majesty of nature, and it plays such a big role in their stories. And it's something that you don't see all that much, I think, in modern writing, especially non-fantasy writing, because these things maybe are just a little bit more mundane to us now. And so it's nice to sort of go back and read these old texts where people were just completely overawed by nature. And hopefully it allows you in your own life to appreciate nature in that way as well. Do let me know down in the comments what you think of this video. If you have any further questions about this, let me know as well, and I will endeavour to answer them in the future. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.